Aloha and welcome to the screencast on the play-example-postgresql system. It's a really simple application that just shows how you configure a play application to access a PostgreSQL database. And we'll also show how to deploy. It also shows you how to deploy it to Heroku. The application itself is super simple. The idea is each time you refresh the home page, it increments a counter. You can see so far I've retrieve this page 10 times, and basically what it does is it creates a single table in Postgres that has a row that's added each time the page is retrieved with a timestamp. And so to get this counter, all it's doing is finding out the size of this table. So there's no relationships. It's super simple. Let's take a real quick walkthrough of the code. We'll start with how it's implemented in the controller class. You can see the controller is basically going to find out how many times the page has been retrieved prior to this retrieval by just getting the size of the page retrieval table. And then it's going to add a new entry to the table by creating a new page retrieval instance and then saving that sucker out. And then it just renders a string saying how many times the page has been retrieved. So that's the controller for you. If we look at the model, you can see we have a single entity. We're using the ebean ORM, and it's just got a primary key, and then it's just got this single value, which is the timestamp when the table was retrieved, and it's got the finder, which is the way the ebean query language is implemented. So I think that's basically, the views are very uninteresting. I won't even go there. That's basically how the system works. So given that, how do we make it work with Postgres? Okay, so there's a few things you have to do. One is in your build.sbt, you have to add this line so that you have the PostgreSQL JDBC driver. And then in the conf, in our application conf directory, you can see that we have these lines right here where we are defining the default driver to be org.postgresql.driver. And then interestingly, we have two lines that specify the db.default URL. The idea here is that by default, the default URL is going to be the one that retrieves from the locally running server the database called play-example, or hooks up to the database called play-example-postgresql. And so in the installation instructions, you'll notice that I ask you to run PSQL and create that database, so that then when this thing runs, it's going to find the database that's specified in this string. When we deploy to Heroku, on the other hand, Heroku is going to provision its own PostgreSQL database, and it may have a different name. So the way that we support that within this application conf is to have a second line which says that if we discover an environment variable called database_URL, that value will override the value that we've just given to db_default.url. But if we can't find that environment variable, then we're just going to use, then this line does nothing. Okay? So it's important that you don't actually by accident define an environment variable called database_URL in your local environment. Otherwise, this whole thing falls apart. But assuming that you haven't done that, then this works quite elegantly, and the same code will work fine locally. And then when we deploy to Heroku, it'll pick up a different definition for our default URL. What else do we have in here? We are going to apply evolutions, and that's nice because within the database, we have to define this table. And where are we going to do that? Well, it turns out that we can, if we set up evolutions to run, then the play will check to see whether or not, or the ORM, I guess, will check to see whether or not the correct tables have been implemented. And if not, it will go ahead and do the necessary kind of stuff. And then for ebean, we have to uncomment this line. So that's the way the application conf file looks. If we want to look in this evolutions, you can see this is the file that actually defines the table for PostgreSQL. It's just an ID and a timestamp. Okay, and then you can read about evolutions. They're kind of cool. You know, if you make modifications to your domain model, it will run the downs and then run the ups, which has the effect of magically making your underlying database consistent with whatever your domain model is within your Play application. It has also the magical property of deleting all the data that you might have put into the database before then, so you want to be a little careful about using it. Okay, so that is pretty much all you need to know for just running the database locally. Okay. The other step is deploying to Heroku, where we go through, there's just, you make sure it's in the master branch of a local Git repo, and then you run Heroku create, and then put git push Heroku master, and everything works good. The only file that you need to know about is that there is a proc file that's required to be added just in the case that you're deploying to Heroku. And this file is actually required. Sometimes they say, oh, it's optional, but I don't know. I think it's hard to get away without it. And so you supply it. The first thing that you need is to make sure that this value is the same value as the name of your application. So if you're editing things, you look at this, and then if you go back to your build.sbt, make sure that those strings are the same. Okay? And then also, the reason why this is good is even though Heroku is going to read some stuff from the application.conf file to figure out how to set things up, it doesn't read everything. In particular, it doesn't check to see automatically read in the value of this property. And so if you want to have evolutions run by default at Heroku, which means that it will set up the correct tables and so forth for your domain model during the development phase, then it's nice to have this proc file where you can specify this so that Heroku does the right thing. This other stuff I think it does get by default, but this particular property I didn't see it get by default, and so we need to provide the proc file in order to do it. Okay, I think that's everything you need to know to enjoy using Postgres with the Play framework.